continues to be normal.
Chamber pressure looks good.
Following up. Roger, roll, Atlantis.
Water towers can fly!
Yes! Ego Delta nominal.
Flight outside SC off. Again, SC off.
Yikes. You bet. Okay. We don't need any more of these.
All right, Chad, I've got a question for y'all. Who do you think prompted this opening shot? Of all the people that work at NASA Spaceflight and have all of their favorite launch vehicles, why do you think the opening shot is this? Anyone have a guess? Anyone have an inkling of a clue as to what may have prompted this? Hey, everybody, welcome to this week's episode of NASA Spaceflight Live. Everyone in chat has the correct answer, Chris B, because we've got the shuttle tanker spotting down in Starbase. And I've also seen a bunch of 5x5s in chat, so that means you can all hear me, which is a good thing because I am your host for this week's episode of NSF Live. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. As you may have guessed, we've got some live views from Starbase for today's episode. And we've got this camera pretty up close and personal with a Booster 7 and Ship 24 today, which is, of course, the full stacked Starship system down there in Starbase, getting ready for an orbital flight, hopefully before too long. We'll be taking your questions about Starship, Starbase, other things going on around the world in spaceflight. But it won't be just me, of course. I got to introduce the other people that are on the show with me today. First and foremost, Ian Atkinson, reporter for NASA Spaceflight. Ian, how are you doing?
Hey, it's going good. How are you doing, Thomas? Excited for another episode.
Oh, I'm doing well, and thanks for joining me, Ian. I believe we also got another NSF contributor on comms with us as well, Mr. Sawyer Rosenstein. Sawyer, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Thomas. This is my first NSF Live as a commentator here, and proud to be part of it. Excited to talk about Starbase.
Glad to have you, Sawyer. Thanks for tuning in. Again, we'll be taking questions about everything that, what we're talking about, what you're seeing on the screen. And the best way for you to ask those questions, chat, is if you tag us at NASA Spaceflight. And I'll be using some handy-dandy software that our own Michael Baylor wrote once upon a time to bring those questions in, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. But we're going to be talking about the latest from down in Starbase, Texas, as well as we can totally go off topic and talk about other things. But we've got all of these live camera views from Starbase, and we got a couple of vehicles out there at the launch site, as well as a couple other vehicles that are making progress back in the production site as well. So why don't we start with just a quick recap for those who may not have been paying super close attention to Starbase the last week. Let's start with what we can see on the screen right here. Ian, what vehicles are in view in this frame?
Yeah, so we got in view right now. I mean, obviously front and center, there is Booster 7 with Ship 24 stacked atop. And that's been the focus, actually, for the past, honestly, few months, really. You can see there's a lot of work going on, especially around the base of the launch mat right now. And that is coming off of a recent test, which was a partial cryogenic propellant loading test. Now we saw a bit of liquid nitrogen, or it might have been liquid oxygen, loaded onto only only one tank on each vehicle. But yeah, that was one of the first cryogenic proof tests we saw with both vehicles. And it seems like there's been a bit of a downtime now over the weekend, and we may get back into some testing this week. Potentially maybe static fires, maybe a full wet dress rehearsal, maybe a full cryogenic test. We don't know. And honestly, we're going to find out the day that the notices come out on what we're going to be seeing in terms of testing. But also on the left side, we have Booster 8 there, which has kind of been sitting to the side for a while. And it's kind of confusing as to why it's been sitting there so long, because we know they do have a booster-specific structural test stand right next to the orbital pad where they can do cryogenic loading and do some structural testing on the vehicle like that. So it seems like Booster 8 is just waiting for maybe the static fire campaign to be completed. Then it will take its spot on the structural test stand, or maybe there's been some mix-up in testing. And just off screen to the left right now, we can see Ship 25. Now, again, it's not visible on screen right now, but Ship 25 has been rolled out for its initial cryogenic proof testing. That's the next vehicle, obviously, after Ship 24, and is simultaneously the second orbital vehicle set to fly, and also a backup should anything happen to Ship 24. And there you can see it on the pad with its beautiful and very smooth-looking thermal protection system. So a lot of activity at the site. We have two pairings of ships and boosters at the launch site for the first time, because if things go according to plan as we're expecting, Ship 25 should lift off on top of Booster 8. But again, things are changing rapidly down there, and that depends entirely on how Booster 7 and Ship 24 perform in testing. But That's what we got at the launch site right now. We also have a bunch of vehicles in production in the moment over at the production site. We'll discuss that. Well, we can discuss that right now because
Yeah,
we have
right now,
booster.
because handy
Yeah,
dandy camera views. There you go.
it's
Ian,
almost
keep
like
taking away.
it's almost like we have cameras at the site, but what you're looking at there is the freshly stacked Booster 9 inside the Mega Bay. And if I'm looking at it correctly, it looks like we have grid fins installed already. So Booster 9 is very deep into assembly. It even has the chines installed on the side, the aerodynamic covers for the carbon overwrapped pressure vessels. So a lot of progress on Booster 9 there. It is never a dull or boring day at Boca Chica, and there are those grid fins. Now, those are a much slimmer grid fin design than we've seen before on, say, Booster 4 or Booster 5. And again, that's going to help out with minimizing the mass of the vehicle and things along those lines. But yeah, freshly stacked Booster 9, we're expecting this again. Current expectation is that this will lift off with Ship 26 on top, but again, that depends on how the testing campaign goes. But yeah, and we also have a section of Booster 10, which is not visible right now, unfortunately, but just to the left of Booster 9, there is the forward tank section of Booster 10. We also have parts of Ship 26 and 27 inside the high bay. So, deep breath. That is all the vehicles that we have seen at Boca Chica right now.
There's a whole lot of them, but you mentioned a couple things there. The grid fins, they actually recently, just this week, fully stacked Booster 9. The grid fins were installed kind of early on in the process, and then they did the full stacking. I think recently they've also been working on adding the chines to that vehicle, and you can see that vehicle is kind of fully, or looking very close to fully assembled down in the Mega Bay right now. So a couple different boosters in different phases of production. Also, talking about Booster 8 out at the launch site, it's interesting because that vehicle, obviously, it doesn't have its engines installed yet. So the presumption was it was going to do some sort of cryo testing and stuff like that. There are some self-propelled modular transporters, or SPMTs, out that on that side of the launch site, and we've been wondering if that means Booster 8 might roll back. I don't think. I mean, did we see Booster 8 do any testing? Maybe a sneaky ambient test that we might not have noticed?
Nothing excuse me, nothing that I have seen. Booster 8 seems to have just been moved out there and in storage right now. So kind of confusing, especially since it looks like Booster 9 is further along in assembly than Booster 8 because it has grid fins installed. So maybe there's been a bit of a shakeup. I mean, we know that Elon Musk has said in the past they have no issue whatsoever skipping over a vehicle if the next
Mhm.
vehicle in line has upgrades. So again, maybe Booster 9 has, I don't know, less mass or better structure or something.
Sure.
But again, at the same time, it could be just Booster 8 is just waiting for the static fire campaign to be done. We don't know exactly.
Sure. Anyway, so yeah, so a couple of there is Booster 8, grid finless Booster 8, sitting out at the launch site. So yeah, a couple different vehicles out there. Trying to think what else. We saw Ship 25 undergo some work. They basically, every once in a while, people point out that there's that crane, and when they attach that to the top nose cone of a ship, all of a sudden people are like, "Oh no, they're going to lift it, they're going to roll it back, something's wrong." But they don't. And this week was another example of that. They attached the crane to the top of Ship 25. More likely than not, that's simply to just help support the ship while they do some internal work that you can't have the ship pressurized for. We get that question a lot, like, are the ships and boosters pressurized when they move them around or when they're doing certain testing? A lot of the times, those vehicles are partially pressurized just to make them more structurally sound, because that way, instead of building a vehicle that has to support its own weight all the time, you can build the vehicle to be lighter and have thinner tank walls and stuff like that, where you're relying on pressurization for a little bit of your strength. And so that's just, but if you have to unpressurize it, that means you have to support it with a crane or something like that while you do that work. So anyway, we saw that go on this week too, but Ship 25 probably getting ready for its test campaign. Are there engines on Ship 25 or engineless over there?
It cannot have engines on it if they're putting it on Pad A because Pad A has the what's the name of them? The pusher things.
I've heard they have a couple of different things. There's like
Thrust
thrust
rams.
rams,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's the way to simulate the force of a firing engine when they do cryogenic thrust without obviously having to ignite the engines or even have engines installed, load fuel and stuff like that. But yeah, so yeah, quick roundup of the vehicles we've got out there, and that's given us some time for questions to start coming in. So I think we're just going to go ahead and dive into this. What do you say, guys?
Go
Let's
for
do
it.
it.
All right. First one comes from Rocket Man Andrew, who asks, when do we think that SpaceX will build a lunar lander prototype? Talking, of course, about the HLS variant of Starship Moonship. I don't know, it's got a couple different names, but SpaceX selected to be the moon lander for the first couple Artemis missions, Sawyer. When would you start to expect to see maybe a lunar variant of Starship show up somewhere?
I think we could probably expect it in the next year or two. I think right now, obviously, the main focus is getting the actual ship 24 or 25, whichever one ends up flying first, into orbit and proving Starship as a whole. But deep down in the, you know, interiors of SpaceX, they're still working on the plan, the design, and the modifications. But I think once they have their main vehicle set and ready to go, that's when they'll really start pushing hard on getting that lunar prototype out. So probably a year or two.
All right, Ian, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say maybe about in like a year, maybe a year and a half, we'll see like a crude Starship prototype. And that may be, again, like what we saw with the previous lunar prototype, where it's just a nose cone that they outfit. I would not be surprised to see that literally any day now, like a crew.
Like that could, yeah, you wouldn't be surprised if that showed up very soon.
Yeah, like I'd say within a year, I would be surprised if we haven't seen something like that. But in terms of a full like prototype lunar Starship variant, I'd say probably about 2 years or so for that.
Yeah, yeah, that's the difference, and it's worth clarifying that there are. I think we're here talking about a full Starship that has not just the normal Raptors, but it'll have those smaller landing engines that we've seen on renders before for moon landings. It'll have the paint job. It might have some sort of crew cabin, at least prototype or something. It'll need a docking port, solar panels, stuff like that. We have seen individual parts for the Lunar Lander prototype. Like they've made a prototype elevator for it at some point. There have been some mock-ups of crew cabin stuff and things like that. So they have built components of prototypes or pathfinders to help inform the moon version. But I think talking about a more full up prototype vehicle that's actually a Starship, um, that would be in the next year or so. Keep in mind the timeline for that is the first landing likely not until 2025. And so figure you're going to preface that by an uncrewed landing maybe in 24, depending on how quickly that goes. I would say hopefully by next year we at least see some sort of prototype vehicle either in the works or ready for some testing.
And that's
And
another
actually,
good point there too that you're mentioning is the fact that all of the additions that they have to make specifically for the lunar landing portion, like the docking ports and especially the elevator, since it's not going to be a ladder like Apollo,
Mhm.
allowing the crews down onto the surface. So that's its own challenge in itself.
Yeah.
also, too, the engines that you discussed, I would be shocked if we don't see just like kind of like a dummy Starship, kind of along the lines of like as simple as like Ship 24, with those and with like a few of those engines installed, the upper engines, as well as maybe like I don't know, like a window to see how that deals with vibrations. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see like expendable Starships that are like specifically designed to test some aspects before they send up a
Mhm.
fully built and expensive test lander.
Sure, that would make a lot of sense, I believe. All right, here our next question here from Vakos. Which booster do you think will be the first to fly 2 times? Ian, you get to go on this one first because I
Oh
picked
God.
your name.
You're throwing me right into the ringer. Uh, I'd say beyond Booster 20.
Oh,
Let's say
wow.
Booster 23. Nah. I'll say like Booster 18, actually. I don't see it happening super soon, especially because SpaceX is, rapidly. Right now, they're basically trying to get the production line going fast. And we've seen SpaceX wanted to refly Ship 15 or SN15, but they just never did because SN16 was right next. So I think we could see a situation like that where they're just going to keep flying new ones, expending them, maybe test landing and then scrap them or whatever. But I think it'll be a while before we see a reflight of a booster.
All right, Sawyer, what do you think? Booster serial number for the first reflown booster.
Uh, hmm. I'm gonna go with. I'm actually going to go a little further. I'm gonna go probably 20. Just because, again, as you mentioned, we're so early on, and every single Starship that we've seen so far, the boosters have had some pretty significant significant changes and modifications to it. So I think until they are just going down to tweaks as opposed to large design improvements, they're just going to have to keep building new ones.
All right.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna low-key cheat on this question. I'm gonna say booster 21 because the first Falcon 9 to be reflown was B1021. So I'm just gonna use that as a reference and say
Ooh.
booster 21 will be the first reflown super heavy booster because I have a small shred of evidence that that's kind of the right number.
I
Okay.
changed my bid to $1, Bob.
All right, let's bring in another question here. Benedict says, "Is there an official launch date?" No. Maybe. Well, okay, there could be an internal launch date, but there's no publicly announced a launch date. And we got a follow-up question here that I'm just going to tie in here. Why not? Why haven't they already done a launch by now? What are they waiting for? And I think the big key items to be watching for are the completion of static fire testing. Booster 7 has only fired, 7 engines at once so far?
Right.
And so there are 33 engines on that thing. I think it is a fair assumption to say that we would expect a 33 engine static fire before they attempt an orbital launch. We would also expect a full wet dress rehearsal at some point. This past week, we have seen cryogenic testing of both the ship and the booster in the full stack configuration. They started with the liquid oxygen tanks, and then they tested the methane tanks separately. However, we didn't see a full wet dress where both tanks were filled, and we didn't see them even fully load the tanks. They were both partial fill tests. So progress for sure, but there's a couple steps that we expect them to see and prove out before they have the confidence to fully fuel the vehicle and light all 33 engines and release it from the launch mount to let it try to go to orbit. And of course, that also has to come after the FAA launch license, but that likely won't come until some more of those testing milestones are complete anyway. So, anyway.
And to add just one thing to add on to what you were saying, obviously, like the star of the show in terms of like, oh, is it ready or not, has been Booster 7 and Ship 24.
Right.
And it seems like there still is a bit of work left on them. Obviously, the testing, maybe a little bit of modifications here and there with what they see from testing. But the big thing here to me seems to be the ground support. And I say that because it seems like every week they're changing out some kind of equipment on ground support, be it like a pump or a subcooler or this or that, or they're adding new piping to the launch mount, or they're replacing this, adding new stuff here. So it seems like the ground support is very much the main thing being tested here. And I would wager that the ground support is the main thing holding them up, because all of this is brand new. Like they've tested some things obviously on the suborbital mounts, but this is big stuff. You need to fuel 2 vehicles, keep them pressurized, communicating with each other, supported. You need to pump propellants like 100 meters up. Like there's a lot that needs to be done here. And it seems like that's what this test campaign is really about, is fine-tuning that and figuring out, how do we work with this? Is our equipment right here? How can we improve this for future flows? And I think a good silver lining here is that when we see Booster 8 and Ship 25 or whatever's flying next, it should be, at least I would hope, a much quicker test campaign.
Yeah, sure. Bringing in some more questions here. I also have some super chats that are coming in, so I do want to thank people who send support to the streams and things like that. Biscuit Wolves has a question: how many of the recent tests are engine related versus how many are for propellant load testing? So the recent tests have been, cryogenic tests on both the booster and the ship. Oh, do we have a cameo from the shuttle tanker really quick? Oh yeah, bottom of your screen, shuttle tanker. Everyone wave goodbye to the shuttle tanker.
Oh, I could talk about. Don't get me started. I'll talk shuttle.
But those recent tests, would have had any engine involvement, or is that just a prop load kind of GSE test, like you were mentioning, Ian, as far as loading those cryogenics into both booster and ship?
I mean, I guess the engines are involved in some way for most testing. I mean, for cryogenic testing, I would assume they're kind of just they're shut off. But I'd say most of the recent ones have probably been prop load testing to test out like pressurizing the vehicles, how they interact together, how the GSE works. And I mean, we've obviously seen engine testing with the like little bit of wet dress rehearsals they've done with the booster with the static fires. But I'd say a lot of the most recent testing has been prop loading.
Right. And I mean, a big ticket item has to have been loading the ship with the QD arm, because that's brand new and hasn't been done before with a full stack. So that's definitely a big milestone that we've seen them load. I think both tanks on the ship, right? We've seen them load something into both the methane and the liquid oxygen tank, even if it might have just been nitrogen or something.
I feel like it was just one tank, but I may be incorrect on that. There's been a lot of stuff happening.
I
I
know
think it
they
was two on
use.
two separate days.
Yeah, well, because the second day of testing, they like stopped in the middle and then resumed testing again. The first day they did liquid oxygen testing, and I believe they hit both the LOX tank on the booster and the ship. And then the second day, the first test that day was only methane on the methane tank on the booster. I don't think they ever loaded anything on the ship. But then when they resumed testing, did they get to loading the methane tank on ship? I'm waiting for Alex is typing in the back channel. He'll check me. Um, I feel like the second test they did, but maybe I could be just misremembering. I know they tested the LOX tank on the ship with a full stack. But either way, I definitely more of cryoloading testing, and not really an engine test. That'll come back when they do either a spin prime of some kind, or they can move back into static firing.
I
And then
didn't
Alex
realize.
confirming that they did eventually get to the methane tank during that second test that day. Here we go. Here's the replay of that day. So let's see. So that's them loading the methane tank on the
Mhm.
booster, but only on the booster. So that was the first test they did that day. And then you can see them unloading it as the frost line recedes again. And then when they do a later test, oh well, this is going to be another close-up view. These are replays from on Wednesday was this test.
And I love all these different camera views that we have all around here. This one, I mean, is super up close.
Oh yeah, I mean, I could stare at the Starbase cameras all day, and I do sometimes.
And I do sometimes, yeah, perfect.
It's perfect for a second monitor, I'll say that. And there's the methane tank on the ship being loaded as well.
Yeah, just a little bit. Like we said, this is a partial load, but a little bit of a frosting up there. So there we go.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a close-up of that. So see, I wasn't crazy. All right, I'm gonna bring in another question here. How is the ship attached to the booster, and how do they detach in space? We saw a little bit of this when we were seeing them conduct the full stack, and they were placing the ship onto the booster. There are those pins around the perimeter, right, Sawyer?
Exactly. On the top of the booster itself, there are, I believe it's 3 pins that kind of stick up and attach themselves to
Yep.
the actual vehicle itself. And once it actually gets up into space and it's time for it to separate, it's basically just some hooks that end up releasing, and then it kind of goes on its way, and the momentum from the turn of the vehicle getting off of it is basically how it separates itself and continues onward.
Yeah, they take a page out of the Starlink playbook here because for Starlink missions, they just have the stack of satellites that are like held together, and when you release the tension rods, the satellites are just free to float about. But before they separate, the upper stage is spinning slowly, not super quickly or anything, but a little bit of a spin so that the relative momentum of all of those satellites kind of naturally helps start spreading them out. And then, of course, they'll deploy their solar panels, and they start maneuvering themselves and use their thrusters to start raising their orbits and things like that. They're doing something similar with the booster and ship. So when those hooks that you were just talking about release, right before them, they're actually like before MECO, the booster will start pitching up a little bit. And so when the hooks release, the ship and booster will just kind of naturally separate. Couple benefits of that. First of all, you don't need like a pusher mechanism or something pyrotechnic to separate to start pushing the ship away so it can start its Raptors. But also, the booster will then have some momentum to already start the boost back burn. Because remember, the booster is pretty much baseline to always be returning to the launch site and land on the chopstick arms for recovery. And so, a little bit kind of a optimization there for getting the booster flipped around quickly, but also the simplest as possible separation mechanism for the two stages. So there you go. All right, here we go. A question from Alan. Going back to the Lunar Starship. Lunar's not a word. A lunar starship.
Playing Kerbal.
Yeah, playing too much Kerbal apparently.
There you
Or
go.
the moon ship maybe. Any of you guys think that the HLS version of Starship could end up being shorter to reduce tip over risk and require fewer tanker flights? Ian, what are your thoughts?
No. I say no because if you make it shorter, then you're starting to deviate from your normal Starship design. Then you need to do different aerodynamic testing, different structural testing, different certification. You need to do more test flights of that short version for NASA to be okay with it. And also at the same time, you're losing propellant. And to get to the moon, with such a large vehicle, you need a lot of propellant, and you need to land, then you need to take off from the surface and dock back to gateway. So you need a lot of propellant to do all of that. So I'm just going to say no. And also too, like with the tip over risk, I understand that like if you're landing on a hill, but I mean, looking at a thing like this, SpaceX is going to be specifically finding using the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. SpaceX and NASA will pretty much specifically be identifying flat, safe areas with not a lot of boulders, so we don't have a repeat of Apollo 11. To land lunar Starship at, and they're going to make sure that these areas are flat. They're not just going to say, okay, let's land on the South Pole, like how you would in Kerbal, just choose a random spot wherever the orbit takes you, and end up landing on a hill and tipping your lander over like I did last night. I'm going to be completely honest, things did not go well. But yeah, they're going to find flat areas, and because you're going to find a flat area, you don't really need to worry about a tip over risk, because you know you're not going to tip over unless you have a lot of horizontal momentum, which, if things go well, it won't. So, all in all, I'd say no. They're probably not going to have shorter versions.
Yeah, and also the other piece of evidence I would just add to that is, like the render you see on your screen there are some official renders from SpaceX or NASA out there, and some official reports about the Artemis program that have shown kind of basic parts of the lunar landing architecture, including Starship. And all of those have shown that the moon landing version of Starship is the same size as the normal Starships. In fact, the only one we've seen be different is the propellant depot, where, so to recap the overall architecture, you launch basically a stretched version of Starship, a little bit taller, but with no recovery hardware or anything to orbit, and that just serves as an on-orbit fuel tank, a fuel depot, that that tankers will then deliver more propellant to. You completely fill the depot, and then the HLS Starship launches last, docks with that, refills with all the propellant in the propellant depot, and then heads out to the moon to await the Orion capsule and the crew. So there is one version of Starship that will be taller or longer or whatever dimension you want to define that as, compared to the normal Starship, but the HLS itself should be kind of standard Starship size, if you will.
And another important thing also is NASA wants that size too, because when you
Right.
have that, you've got all the extra stuff that you can carry with you. As
Yep.
opposed to having to pick up a rover off, part of the Saturn V, you can take all of that, all these larger, more advanced experiments too, so you get the benefit of science in addition to that fuel efficiency.
Yep.
Yeah, you could have like a full laboratory on board. You could bring extra food. You can bring extra equipment, stuff to leave on the surface, because I mean, like as in the Apollo program, they left a lot of equipment on the surface to communicate back with Earth. So they could have, say, university experiments or NASA experiments that the astronauts deploy over the few days that they're on the surface.
There you go. All right. Our next question comes from Oliver the Space Nerd, who says, why did SpaceX choose to build the orbital launch mount for Starship instead of a launch structure similar to Falcon 9?
That would be a pain in the butt. I think that's basically the best way to say it. I mean, it's... Oh, go ahead, Sawyer. Go ahead.
No, I'm with you on this one. I mean, when you just think of the size of the two vehicles stacked together, the amount of effort that it's going to take to build all of the towers and structures and everything completely surrounding it like that to hold it in place. I mean, you've got something as simple as the orbital launch mount, which can take all of the weight, and then you only need one or two arms for balance. So, why not use less materials if it's just as sturdy? Because otherwise, you're going to be building a lot of stuff.
I think the something, another element of this that we've brought up before, the orbital launch mount is a very elevated launch platform. If you look at somewhere like 39A, Pad 40, or Slick 4 over at Vandenberg, those 3 Falcon launch sites, they all are at launch pads that have dedicated flame trenches with a diverter to help direct the energy out and away from the pad. SpaceX tried to make it simpler by raising the launch mount so that you don't need a diverter per se. You just have the launch mount high enough above the ground where the energy can naturally disperse kind of in all directions. Now, will that work out? Not sure yet. They haven't fired more than 7 engines yet. But that seems to be the current plan. And it's not without merit. I mean, we've seen basically all the Soyuz launch pads are basically just built in off the side of a small cliff. And so the Soyuz exhaust just kind of goes out the cliff, and there's a giant area for the energy to kind of disperse. But granted, much different energy levels there. So as far as this orbital launch mount, I think it was purpose built for making the design of the launch site a little bit more simple. You don't have to dig into the ground to create a flame trench and stuff like that. Also keep in mind that it's a bit of a different rollout architecture. Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, they roll out on the transporter erector horizontally, are raised to vertical over the flame trench and stuff like that. Whereas boosters and ships roll out vertically and are put in place by the chopsticks and stuff like that. So it is a different architecture, and those would all indicate or basically inform a different type of launch mount. All right, what other questions we got here? Karmaflaw says, oh, here's a good question. Why is the heat shield made of a bunch of different smaller tiles and not one huge single part or one single component of thermal protection system?
Ooh, that's a good one. Do you want to take that one, Sawyer? Or
Yep, you got it, and I'll add in after.
cool. So the main reason, or there's a few reasons. The first one is to build something like that. The tiles are made out of something called what's it called? Tough rock, something related to tough rock. It's related to the space shuttle thermal protection system, and those are very lightweight, very fragile. Like literally, if you're holding one and you drop it, it's going to shatter like a plate. So first off, they're very fragile, but also it would be immensely difficult to build something 50 meters tall and 9 meters wide that is that fragile and that thin. Imagine trying to transport that, trying to manufacture that. That would be a pain. So instead, they're choosing to make a bunch of small tiles that are about the size of a dinner plate. And now that's good because you can mass produce those small tiles, get like a whole assembly line going pretty much of those, mass produce them. And the good thing is, if one of them cracks, you just replace that one tile. Now imagine if you had a 50 meter by 9 meter giant tile and you had a tiny crack in it, a tiny crack just in a small part of it. You need to replace the entire thing. How much would that cost? Probably a lot. So they're doing it both for the simplicity of building it, simplicity of transporting it, as well as replacing things that get damaged. Now, remember how many tiles we've seen damaged from Ship 24 in the recent testing. Now, it's only a small fraction of the tiles that they have on there, so they can just replace them easily. But if that was a huge single-piece tile, they would have had to do pretty much several full replacements at this point of a gigantic, probably multi-million-dollar tile.
Exactly,
Yep,
and kind of adding on to that, it goes back as well to the shuttle days where you would have, 20,000 tiles on the underside of some of these vehicles. When you think about it that way, you also have a little bit of redundancy in there too, of if a tile chips or breaks, there's all of them around it. Whereas if you break one giant tile, you have to replace the entire heat shield. So it makes it easier to do a quick swap out or replacement or repair if something were to happen to the tough rock, which, by the way, in case you're wondering, is the toughened uni-piece fibrous reinforced oxidation resistant composite.
I'm sorry. Can we get that one more time?
It is a toughened uni-piece fibrous reinforced oxidation resistant composite. Tough rock.
Can we get some applause in the chat for Sawyer on that one? That was impressive. Anyway, please continue.
I love my thermal tiles. I'm sorry. What can I say? Goes back to the shuttle days. But yeah, and that's the other thing, is learning a lot from shuttle's tile system as well. Of obviously STS-1, there was some adhesion issues, especially when they first transported it out to the Cape in the late 70s. But it's working off of that and making it even lighter and even stronger. And the fact that now that they are repairability, for lack of a better word, and replacement abilities with it, it just makes it all around safer while keeping that super strong material.
All right. I'm going to quit the questions coming here. And we got a super chat question from Musical Wolf. So thank you so much for that support. Asking how many vehicles are at Starbase, partial counts. All right, well, hold on. Space vehicles, or does every car count? Because I don't know about that one.
All right, so I see two in the frame right now. There's two. There's another at the launch pad now.
So we got at least three boosters, but we're also up to the booster 10 has been spotted. So let's say 4 boosters, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then ship 24 and 25, so that's 2 ships. Is there any well, here's the thing, does a single ring for a ship count? How partial are we talking? Realistically, there's 6 vehicles, 4 boosters and 2 ships.
I would say once there is 2 segments stacked, I would say that's a partial. So I think in that case we have ship 26 counted as well, because that's partially stacked in the high bay.
Yeah. All right, so we're like kind of in the realm of 7-ish in various stages of production. Oh, but what about all of the oh geez, the
Test tanks.
well, not just testing, but like the rocket garden. Do all those count?
Then we have Booster
Oh, jeez.
5. And,
Yeah, there are a lot. There are a lot of vehicles at Starbase. Some retired, some in testing, and some in various stages of production. All right, another question here. Chris L says, "What are they doing with the top of the Mega Bay? Wasn't that supposed to be like a restaurant or a bar or something?"
that was the top of the high bay is
Oh,
a
that was the top of
bar.
the high bay.
The top of the mega bay, I mean, that looks like I haven't seen it super up close. Maybe we could pan up a little bit, but I think it looks like it's about the size of
Ooh, pan up.
2
Jack's gonna be mad
floors.
at Ian for that one.
I don't
It's
know
gonna be tilt
terminology.
up,
Tilt.
Ian.
Oh, my dear.
He's going to be tilted after that.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
like it feels like to me like they could put another like set of like offices or some other type of livable space up there.
yeah, like that could be like design offices or I don't know, something like that. Maybe a big restaurant or
Yeah, an even bigger restaurant. Like I
Yeah.
don't know.
I mean,
And
that'd be
just to point
perfect.
out, this all isn't unheard of. There, at one point, were offices and things inside the launch tower at 39A at Cape Canaveral. So imagine a restaurant now on top of the high bay. Oh, that would be cool. Or the mega bay.
There are a lot of offices inside the vehicle assembly building too, going like all the way
Yep.
up. So this is totally normal.
Really quick, thank a couple people that have gifted some memberships because Blake
Oh,
Alexander sent
look at
in
this camera
5.
view.
What are we looking at? Blake, thanks for the red team
Hmm.
memberships.
Hmm.
It looks like
Wonder
it's
what-
moving as if it's
This
on a
camera is
cursor.
Like it's
moving.
mounted on someone's shoulder, maybe.
Oh,
Yeah,
there's
we
a
have a thumbs
thumb.
What has DOS been doing with the cameras?
I think we have a wild DOS sighting, or at least DOS's hand sighting. Apparently that camera feed is approved for being shown live today, I learned. So thanks, DOS, for the up-close camera view there. There he is. Thanks, DOS. Oh, man. Really quick, Multispace Industries also gifted 5 red team memberships. So Multi, thank you so much for that. Oh, here's another question. Ties in with a similar one we got earlier. Terrace with the super chat. What will be reflown first, a booster or a Starship?
Ooh.
We
Oh,
talked about. All right,
man.
we were speculating earlier that the first booster to be reflown would be in the realm of like booster 20 or so. Obviously, that's not going to be the same for the ship because we're already at 24. But what as far as timeline goes, not serial number, which one might we see first?
I will wager booster. And I will say that because SpaceX already has experience reflying boosters. The booster will have a much more tame reentry and recovery process than the ship will. Not only does the ship have to go through reentry, it has to do that without a damaged heat shield, and then has to descend without damaged flaps, damaged Raptors from said reentry, and then flip itself and land. There's a lot that could go wrong there. And I think the booster has a better chance because SpaceX has experience with boost backs, with controlling vehicles using grid fins and precision landing them.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my 2 cents there. Oh, and look who's that.
Oh,
Hey!
hi, DOS.
The pavement ends and the DOS begins.
He's in the middle of nowhere. But yeah, okay. So I kind of agree with you there, Ian, that the booster would probably have precedent to be reflown first. However, I would point out that SpaceX does have experience reflying Dragons, which is like orbital reentry and coming back, and so they do have experience of reusing orbital vehicles, but I think Starship is a different beast.
And see, my 2 cents in here as well is that I think it's going to be close between them because when you think about it as well, they have flown prototypes of them before, not the exact ones that we see now, but it's not like they've never tried firing up those Raptors and landing it back at Starbase. So they have that experience with this exact vehicle already. So it may be close. I could see either one, honestly.
That's true. I would say another thing too, just real quick, is the heat shield itself. I would bet money that it's going to take a few flights to get the heat shield working properly, as in to have no damage on liftoff, no damage from vibrations or max Q in flight. And I think because of that, I would not be surprised if the first few vehicles fail on reentry. And again, that would not be a horrible thing because you still get a lot of great data from that on how to build better. But I think it's going to be a little bit longer before we see a successful Starship recovery than a booster recovery.
I mean, also, there's something to even if it doesn't have damage to the point where it doesn't successfully re-enter. I mean, the first couple shuttles, Sawyer, correct me if I'm wrong, definitely had, the first re-entries were rough on those heat shields, and they were missing tiles, damaged tiles, and stuff like that. But they improved it down the line to make it even better. But even, STS-1 still successfully re-entered.
Oh
So,
yeah,
while
there was one where they almost had a burn through. I believe it was back in 1985, where there was some serious tile damage, and if it wasn't in the exact spot that it was on the orbiter, it could have burned through and destroyed the vehicle on reentry. So they had some really close calls, but thankfully most of them were able to make it okay, with the unfortunate exception being STS-107 Columbia.
Right. Well, so even those first vehicles, like, we will expect that after the first reentry, they will have improvements to make to the heat shield. But that doesn't preclude the idea that the first reentry attempt is actually successful, but they still have to learn a bunch from it and say, okay, the heat shield was in pretty rough shape after that reentry. We got work to do.
Heck, Shuttle was making changes all the way through basically until the end of the program for the most part. They
Right.
would tweak and adjust, and again, after 107, they came up with the techniques to be able to do on-orbit repairs.
Right. So, a couple points of consideration there for sure. All right, Gwen brings our next question, which is, do you think that SpaceX has time to crack refueling in orbit safely before 2024, or is it more likely that that will be the cause of a delay? Referring to a moon landing, I'm assuming. Definitely required for the HLS architecture. HLS needs to be refueled in low Earth orbit before it heads to the moon, so demonstrating on-orbit refueling will be part of that architecture. And do we think that that could become a long pull item for returning humans to the moon? Ian, your thoughts?
Yes, I could see that being an area not necessarily of big problems, but of typical developmental delays, like how SpaceX expected to fly with Booster 4 and Ship 20 last year, but developmental issues came along. So I could see refueling being kind of in the same realm, where maybe the first attempt or two is going to be okay, we can't do this, or there's some significant issues, but we're able to do it. So I think it's going to be a bit of a delay in terms of refueling tests, because that's going to require some major changes to the ship as well, adding new connectors to the bottom, having docking adapters on the bottom, things like that. But I don't think it's going to be a significant error. I think they could definitely do it, but it's going to be a few years away from right now, I would say.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
All right.
I'll agree with
Go ahead.
that, and also keeping in mind the fact that I hate to bring it up this way, but the actual lunar landing might be slipping as well, which might not be a bad thing to give more time for all of this testing so that SpaceX is ready for whenever NASA is.
Yeah, I think as far as human landing system development, I think on-orbit refueling might be the final piece that needs to be developed successfully before Starship is ready to support. However, as far as supporting a moon landing overall, you also need a successful Artemis 1 mission, Artemis 2 mission, and then you need Orion and SLS to be ready to launch Artemis 3. Also need crew training to be ready. We haven't seen, hopefully after Artemis 1 launches, we'll get the Artemis 2 crew announced, but we don't even know the crew for Artemis 3 yet. So there are other things that also have to happen that are outside of SpaceX's part of Artemis 3. All right. Some guy, no, seriously, that's the name, that's their YouTube username. Anyway, says, are there any plans for a soft water landing such as the one SpaceX did for Falcon 9's booster? I think, and I'll open this up after I start here, I think the plan for the first orbital test flight last we heard was basically the booster ideally could make a catch attempt or a landing on the chopsticks attempt. However, that relies on everything up to that point going well, and if anything goes wrong with the booster before then, obviously something, if something happens before staging, that's a different problem. But staged it successfully, but then boost spec burn has an issue or some other guidance issue on the way down, it would abort to maybe attempting a soft water landing. Would we expect them to make an attempt if everything's going right, or do you think that even if the booster is performing perfectly, the first flight might only be like a soft water landing or something?
I mean, the original paperwork that they filed for the first orbital test flight was just going to have the booster splash down in the water. So obviously, it's in the back of their minds that I could see that still being, a consideration. But knowing them, it would probably be similar to what they already do with the Falcon 9 boosters, which is aim for a target, and if it looks like it's not going to make it, divert as opposed to turning to it.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean,
All right.
I would not be surprised if they just choose to do a downrange landing like they did for Falcon 9. Because you still get good data on terms of maybe they could do a partial boost back burn like they do on some Falcon 9 missions.
Sure.
And then, of course, you do your simulated water landing. Or I've even heard people suggesting maybe they could do sort of simulated landing where they say, hey, the ground is actually 2 kilometers above the ground. So
Yeah,
it
right.
lands, basically hovers midair and then shuts down its engines and then is destroyed on impact. So you don't have any, you don't have a 70-meter basically building floating in the
Right.
ocean. But I still think you can get some great data from that as well, and I would not be shocked if they did that.
Yeah, sure. Definitely all options on the table, and would expect to hear more closer to flight. Multispace Industries with a super chat question who says, how many super heavies do you think will get the Falcon 9 Block 4 treatment, i.e. one reflight before being expended or tearing it open with inspections?
I think it's going to be a while. I mean, it's still really a big learning process, even as they're designing it. So I think a lot of it, while they have it, is going to be tearing it down, seeing what's inside, kind of like what they were already doing with the earlier test flights down at Starbase before we got to the full stacking here. So I would say we're still going to see that for quite a while, especially given the fact that it took years to finally get to the Block 5 variant that we have now of Falcon 9.
But yeah, I mean, remember, before Block 5, no boosters flew more than twice. So I could definitely see them getting some reuse out of them, if not even for just data collection and learning more how to make the vehicle actually reusable. But also keep in mind, they are bringing the data in for Falcon 9 to help support that too. So maybe it'll be a quicker path, and earlier starships and boosters would have a decent chance of being reflown, more than once.
I'm kind of conflicted on this because it both wouldn't surprise me if they did a sort of Block 4 approach like Moldy's here is saying, and do a single flight and then a single reflight and then see what happens. But also, I wouldn't be too surprised if they just went, okay, this one looks good, let's do it a third time. Okay, it looks good, let's do it a fourth time. It wouldn't really shock me either way, and I'm kind of leaning towards the Block 4 approach because, like we've been seeing here, and like Elon's been saying, they're taking it slow because if something goes wrong with this full stack on liftoff, things are going to go very wrong. And you don't want to risk destroying your entire launch site just for some extra data.
All right, quick check-in on DOS Cam. Still checking in on the full stack Starship and Super Heavy. Appreciate the camera views, DOS. But
Hey, no problem.
Oh yeah, hey DOS, thanks.
Oh hey, how's it going? Don't mind me, just getting my steps in today.
Oh yeah, we appreciate that. Thanks for helping us out there. All right, our next question here from DOSFoot. I don't know if that has any relation to our DOS, but that's the username. Says, when they start ramping production, where will the hundreds of starships be stored? There's a question.
Oh my god, before we answer this, I am so sorry, but if you look in the bottom right of the camera, you can see DOS on the hill. Just to the right.
Is that is
Yes.
that him?
I'm 90% sure that is DOS on our camera.
It might be. Wait, hold on. I'm gonna take a screenshot of this, and we'll confirm with him because I admittedly the Starship land. Yeah, that's you.
That's me.
Yep.
Oh my god.
I'm standing out on the tallest dune at the beach with the wearable camera pack.
DOS for scale.
DOS for scale. Nice.
That's awesome.
Oh no way! Is that from Mars?
Yeah.
Which camera review is this? I don't remember. Oh, Patrick says it's from Rode.
That's Road. Okay.
That's
Nice.
funny.
And DOS DOS.
And that's us. All right, back to the question though. Hundreds of starships. Where are you going to store those?
More land, I guess. I mean, we've seen them building rocket gardens, and they're continuing to expand it seems like. So I guess you just continue to build more platforms, scrap the ones that you really don't need anymore, and just go from there. I don't see it being like a collection of, say, 60 starships until you get to where you have fully operational and full production vehicles that you can fly payloads on. Because something like Ship 24, where it's kind of like sort of like a one-off prototype, not really one-off, but you know what I mean, like an early development prototype that's not too useful beyond just flight data. I think it'll be a while before we get to an issue like that.
All right. Yeah, that does definitely makes sense.
That's gonna be a fun problem to have. And if they need somewhere to store it, I'll take one and put it in my garage.
All right. Another question here from Kyler says, speaking of on-orbit refueling, do you think they will put it in an orbit that's accessible from both Kennedy and Boca Chica to make use of all launch mounts?
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, you could do alternating flights. So, say a flight today from Boca, a flight tomorrow from KSC, then the next day from Boca, next day from KFC, something like that. Or even just have KSC as a backup in case something happens at Boca.
And I think part of that is gonna kind of go along the lines of
We
what was.
are losing DOS.
Yeah,
But I was
Das is trying to call in from remote parts of Boca, clearly.
Well,
should I? What do I do?
I think we need. There we go. We need.
Yeah.
We'll take care of that later. But go on. Sorry.
So I was going to say, you probably do something along the lines of what you do with when they place the orbit for the ISS, which is in an orbit so that it can specifically be launched from Florida. You get it. You can get it from Baikonur. You can get it from when JAXA was launching the HTVs, the ATVs. You've got all these different locations that it's easy enough that in the orbit from those different launch locations, you can still get a pretty direct route to it. So I could see them doing something similar to that, putting it in an orbit that will constantly go over Starbase and KSC and any other potential launch sites they come up with.
All right, there we go. And I should point out the side-by-side views of Kennedy Space Center and Starbase right now. Those are the two currently under construction Starship launch sites. And on the left-hand side, of course, we're also keeping an eye out for a different heavy lift launch vehicle from SpaceX. Falcon Heavy recently rolled back into the hangar at 39A, and we would expect that to roll back out hopefully by tomorrow for a Tuesday morning launch, the fourth ever flight of Falcon Heavy and the first one since 2019. Definitely looking forward to that. But yeah, I think it does make a lot of sense that both Starship launch sites would contribute to on-orbit refueling so they can launch as quickly as possible.
Yep, I'm sure NASA would like that too, to have a backup. Just say worst case scenario, God forbid it ever happens, but like say a pad explosion at Boca Chica where it's offline for likely a year or more. So you could always have KSC as a backup.
Sure. All right. So Westy the Third says no question, just some love for NSF. Appreciate the super chat support there. Also Remy with some super chat support, appreciated there as well. And Kieran, thank you so much. Kieran also comes back in with a question, says, why can't Starship re-enter the same as Falcon 9 and save on the heat shield? The difference there is between suborbital reentry and orbital reentry, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're talking, a much larger vehicle going at a much faster speed. Suborbital is kind of easy to just turn yourself around and slow down, whereas otherwise you're going to encounter a lot more of that atmospheric friction, which again is the whole point of the tiles and the heat shield on that. So it would just be a lot more difficult. They would have to add so much more to the bottom part of the vehicle itself to orient it that way that the weight just isn't worth doing that.
Yep, I agree with that. It'd be much more of a pain to go engines first because then you'd melt your engines, or you need to make your engines a lot more hardy, which makes them heavier, and there's a whole bad trade-off there.
Yeah, thanks, guys. All right, another question here. DNV says, is one heat tile enough to destroy the whole ship during reentry? I think this is referring to, like, if you lose one tile, is that end of mission? And I believe we were talking about earlier how the heat shield is composed of a bunch of different tiles. I think part of that is that if you lose one tile, you would expect to still survive reentry, right?
Hopefully.
Yeah, I mean,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I would think so. Again, like mentioning before with the shuttle, the tiles would fall off and get dinged, and it still made it through, and that's why you have so many of them. I think it's depending on how deep of a gash we're talking about. If you start missing tiles, if it's a bunch of them that fall off in the same area, maybe, but otherwise, the rest of the vehicle should be able to withstand the rest of the heat.
All right. All right, next question here. Oh, all right, we kind of already answered this. Musical Wolves asking, will SpaceX run out of space for Starship storing? I think the general consensus is they won't run into that problem for a while. They will be launching a lot of old vehicles. They'll be scrapping old vehicles and stuff like that before they have a big fleet like they do with Falcon 9 boosters now. There'll be some time before that, I think, but yes. All right. Raymond, thank you so much for the Super Chat support as well. Appreciate that. Nikon says, NASA Spaceflight Starship Storage Facility Fund. We're going to store our own starships now? I didn't know we were in that business, but all right, sounds
I'll
good.
take one. As long as I can get a Raptor off of it.
And there you go. Space Act 2, thanks for becoming a Capcom member. Appreciated that. Tara asked with a question. Are there any major lessons to be learned on the orbital launch mount in Boca Chica before the work on the orbital launch mount in KSC begins in proper? I mean, we know the construction of the launch mount for KSC is already in work, but certainly lessons to be learned from Boca, including with the upcoming static fire and launch testing, right?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, the launch mount at KSC is since they've been starting work on it for probably about 6 months now, if I had to guess. So there hasn't been a lot of time to learn lessons from Boca, but I would not be surprised if the design is slightly tweaked. I mean, we've already seen the legs on the launch mount at KSC are straight instead of having a bit of a knee in them. I think the ones we're really going to see some major differences on would be at Slick 49, which is the far future kind of fully operational Starship launch site at Kennedy Space Center. That is probably several years away. But I would assume with the years of development and the dozens, if not hundreds of launches we're going to have in that time, those launch mounts will kind of be the Block 5, if you may, of launch mounts.
Yeah, there you go. Oh god, launch mount Block 5. Let's not get into that, please.
KSC is Block 2. No.
Oh no.
All right, next question here. Alexis saying, so what do we think are some applications or missions or tasks that Starship could open the door for once it gets its feet off the ground, aside from Mars, of course?
Oh, I wonder who that is.
Oh, I was wondering why we were showing this view. A wild DOS just walks by. Anyway, this is half of this episode is just spying on DOS, by the way.
Literally, that's all that this has become, and I love it.
But yeah, what kind of missions is Starship gonna maybe open the door for?
Honestly, what won't be opened? I think we've already seen SpaceX has contracts to launch, traditional geostationary transfer orbit missions on Starship. And I think just beyond those, it's basically going to take over for Falcon 9. So anything Falcon 9 does right now, including Starlink, excluding crew launches and cargo launches to the space station, at least right now, will be taken over by Starship. So I think that, but also in terms of things it can do uniquely, launching things larger than 5 meters in diameter and larger than 7 meters in diameter, like nuke lens fairing. So it could launch, say, a larger space telescope, or maybe clusters of geostationary satellites, or insanely huge rideshare missions to low Earth orbit. There's a lot of possibilities, and I think there's possibilities that haven't even been discussed yet because something like this doesn't exist. But I'd say the main big one would probably be a big space telescope along the lines of like LUVOIR, or clustered launches being more common.
And one other application I could think of is kind of the exact opposite of that, is returning spacecraft or vehicles back to Earth, depending on how heavy or large they are. You could, in theory, say take Hubble and load it inside of a Starship and land it back home and put it in the Smithsonian. But again, all these are future down the lines, but I certainly see them launching definitely larger missions. Like imagine a transporter type thing that they already have with Falcon, but on this, how many payloads you'd have? That'd be
Right.
nuts.
That would be a lot.
Also, like you said with Hubble, like why put it in the Smithsonian? Why not bring it down, replace the instruments, give it more updated computers and electronics, keep the same mirror assembly, the same structure, just relaunch it on Starship? There's really no limit to what you can do with that. I mean, it could go get like, I know, Chandra or something too. I know Jonathan McDowell would be happy about that. But there's a lot that could be done in terms of why do an orbit boosting of Hubble with Dragon when you could just bring it down, replace some of the instruments, and launch Hubble 2, basically.
Interesting. I mean, you would also imagine, especially once Starship is crewed or crew rated, that servicing missions would become a thing too. So instead of bringing vehicles back down, doing the servicing here on Earth and relaunching, which the shuttle did a couple times, you could also just bring up, if it depends on, I guess, how extensive the work is, but you could also just do servicing missions up in orbit.
Yep,
Oh yeah,
exactly.
imagine the amount of stuff you could bring with you too, as opposed to it having to fit within the shuttle payload bay, which is still about the size of a whole school bus. But yeah, I mean, you could pack so much more science and equipment that you can just keep working on the telescope to your heart's content in one single mission.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, our next question comes from Michael, who says, what do you think Ship 26 and 27 will be used for with no fins or heat shield? Refueling or throwaway Starlink launches? So yeah, definitely been some indications that some future ships, maybe 26 and 27, also checking in on Hoppy, thank you, DOSCAM, will not feature either fins or a heat shield, so clearly not being planned to re-enter and be recovered. What are our predictions to why that may be?
I would say the expendable Starlink launch is definitely up there. We actually discussed this in one of the recent Starship recap videos, but I would say also in terms of big thumbs up there. But also in terms of streamlining production, like right now they're just trying to do an orbital launch. The recovery, it seems like, is definitely a side project right now with Starship. So why not just make something really simple, quick, cheap, and easy to build? So if you lose it, you don't lose that much, but also so you can get it built quicker and have less problems to run into. Because say if like the flaps don't work during a flap test on the pad, okay, now you're a few days delayed. But if you don't have that, you don't need to worry about it. Don't need to worry about TPS. Just to get something to launch, I think that's my take on it.
I mean, it's worth mentioning too, and Alex had a back channel with the reminder that Ship 26 doesn't have a payload bay door. So 26 would also not even be able to support a Starship launch. It could be just a refueling pathfinder, could just be a reaching orbit pathfinder, like you said. Um, but I think expendable Starship launches could make sense. I mean, I guess the part that I don't get though is couldn't the reentry after deploying a bunch of Starlink launches be an experimental thing? Like, why not use a theoretically recoverable vehicle, deploy your Starlink payload, and then the reentry after that is an experiment, whether or not it works? Because you got to prove that out at some point. And as SpaceX has demonstrated with Falcon 9, having the reusable launch cadence or the launch cadence that comes with having reusable vehicles has been super helpful in rapidly deploying Starlink.
Yeah, and I think that's going to come in handy with Ship 24 and 25. If they can get both of those to fly, you get a bit of recovery data, and then while you're flying 26 and 27 and whatever comes after too, you can kind of refine that and then build better ones after that using the data that you already
Sure.
have to kind of like a bit of
Exactly.
downtime.
Exactly. Learn from the earlier ones of 24 and 25. Almost like, how you went from ship 9 and 10 early on, jumping right to 15 with all the major improvements. Same kind of thing here. Use the other kind of more expendable ones while you really fine tune using your already available data.
Right, there you go. That makes sense. All right, here is a question here from Blake. Thank you for the Super Chat support. Any speculation on a commercial space station, not for its own sake, but maybe tied to orbital refueling or a proof of concept for some future moon gateway? So I think referring to using Starship as a commercial space station. Any thoughts on that as an idea?
Um, I mean, there's
I
going to be a lot of orbital. Go ahead, Sawyer.
No, you take this.
There's a spider on our camera. But there are going to be a lot of orbital space stations that are commercial. Like we have Orbital Reef, obviously. There's one by Sierra Nevada, by Northrop Grumman. Everyone's getting into it now. It seems to be the new hot thing. And about Axiom, obviously, is building theirs right now. And SpaceX has even proposed with Starship. I think that's going to be like the way things are going in the late 2020s and into the 2030s. We've seen NASA is slowly switching to commercial, and they're going to be deorbiting the ISS in the late 2020s or early 2030s to move to commercial space stations. So I think commercial space stations are going to be the way to go. It's going to be the way that NASA gets their science done on orbit. And I think that's really the future after the International Space Station.
And I don't know if it could be used as its own space station on its own per se, as you mentioned, with so many other competitors out there, but I can definitely see it being a go-to as a back and forth between gateway.
All right. Bring in another question here. Westy says, does the salt in the air at Boca have to be taken into account with how long the ships or tiles have been out in the elements? Don't even think that's specific to Boca. I think that applies to the Cape Canaveral and the Space Coast, right?
It
Oh.
would have to, yeah.
Yeah, all the vehicles that are out there have some form of at least weatherproofing on there that they can withstand, decent amounts of rain, decent amounts of salt hitting it. As long as it's not sitting out there for months and months on end, which I know some of these are, but as long as you're planning on basically getting it out there, launching it within a month or so, and going from there, you're probably fine.
Yeah, I mean, actually, too, I was seeing pictures of Ship 20 and Booster 4 at the Rocket Garden. They're starting to get rust on them. Even the Raptors on Booster 4 are getting a bit rusty. So, yeah, it's something that they'll have to take into account for long-term storage and long-term reuse of these vehicles.
Gotcha. All right. Bringing in another question here. Chak says, does Booster 7 use the electric TVC yet?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I don't think we know exactly. I don't think we've seen evidence one way or the other, but based on when we saw it show up at McGregor, I don't think we would expect that to be implemented onto a vehicle yet.
Yeah, and Booster 7's quite old for a vehicle, too.
Yeah.
And also, it does have the hydraulic unit still on the side.
Oh, right. Yeah, there you go. Duh. So
I don't know if those would be completely removed with ETVC, if there's still some hydraulic systems, but it doesn't seem like there's any indication they do have it.
right.
I know the plan for sure is for 9 to have the ETVC.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. All right, Ahmed has a question. Says, this time last year, the chopsticks were being installed and Ship 20 was getting all 6 engines installed. What are your predictions for this time next year? Thanks for talking, guys. All right, so this time last year, so they were finishing the launch tower with the chopsticks, and they were installing engines on Ship 20. So now, so assistant to the news director chiming in. Don't know if you heard that, but anyway, now we're up to Booster 7 and 24, but may probably be up to. Let's start. Yes, thank you, Patrick, for the info card. There is. I guess first and foremost, we would expect an orbital launch should hopefully happen by the end of the year, right?
End of next year, yeah. I think at end of this year, I'm like, oh, you're pretty optimistic, but yeah, I'd say there's.
Right, this time, yeah. Sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah, so I'd say definitely by next year, there's going to be some kind of orbital flight attempt.
Yeah, that's my bet as well. And we're going to probably see a ton more boosters and ships go through. It'll be interesting to see what number we get up to. But yeah, we will definitely have at least one orbital attempt, if not hopefully more.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, also too, like when we're discussing like the engine installs on Booster 4 and Ship 20, this time last year was more or less like a fit check, it seemed like. Just quickly attaching them structurally, but not being like hooked up properly. Whereas now it seems like they are obviously fully integrated and being tested.
Right, sure. All right, so there's some predictions there. Again, speculation banner attached to those, but we'll see where we are this time next year. All right, let's see. Next question here. Yeah. John saying the crane attachments on top of Ship 24, are they going to be fitted with TPS where those crane attachment points are? If not, how will they be dealt with? So basically, pointing at that on top of Ship 24, there are still the points where they were using the crane to lift the vehicle before they were doing just chopstick lifts onto the orbital site, obviously. And we expect those to need to be removed if they're going to ever try to re-enter Ship 24. So is it possible they're just not going to re-enter, or would we expect that work to be done at some point here?
I would I would expect them to take the covers off, the crane attachment points off, and then cover them up with tiles. I think the fact that Ship 24 still has them on shows that they're not fully stacked for launch right now. I think they would have to destack it and then get like a man lift up there to take the crane attachment points off. So yeah, I think eventually they will get covered up, but only when they're certain that they won't need them anymore.
Ditto.
Awesome.
All right, talking while muted, sorry. But there we go. Also, just a quick shout out, DOS. Thank you for all these different camera views. Chad is appreciative of the DOS cam that we've added for today.
How long do I have to hold this one here? Like I'm holding this camera with my hand right now. Like, oh look, it's my phone. Like,
oh.
This isn't a tripod. This is like a wearable camera. So,
I mean, the ship seems to be leaning from this perspective a little bit. You know, it's not exactly
oh
level.
my gosh.
Careful, don't let it fall over. That's a multi-million-dollar prototype.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Someone who's just tuning into the stream is going, "What the heck are we looking at?"
A very artsy shot there, yeah.
It's artsy. That's what it is.
NSF is done. We're done with robotic cameras. We're testing human cameras now. So we'll have humans at all our different camera sites.
It's full circle. Like we've come full circle.
It's full circle.
Next time I'm down there, Das, you and I can do some trolley shots then.
Nice, perfect.
All right, next question here is from Duke. Says, why can't Ship 26 and 27 be test vehicles for the human landing system? I think that we discussed it as a potential option, right?
They kind of could be, just testing out a flapless vehicle, how to maneuver it in space and things like that.
Yeah, as for actually testing anything lunar related, though, I mean, there's still so much more testing to be done on the integrity of the vehicle itself, let alone any upgrades or modifications for crew rating.
I think also something to add is launching a finless ship on top of the booster. Like, just a launch sequence with the different aerodynamics might be useful for testing. And that's when you talk about Ship 26 not having a payload of, bay of any kind. That, I think, might tie into that discussion. But I think we will have to see what test profile they end up with. And it also might depend on what they accomplish with Ship 24 and things like that. Steven with also bit a super chat support, so appreciate that as well. Thank you so much. Colin asking for a quick clarification. What is ETVC? So we're talking about electric thrust vectoring control. So we have seen SpaceX experimenting with, or I don't know if it's experimenting with, testing or demonstrating a new thrust vectoring system. So the system that allows the Raptor engines to be steered around and moved so you can redirect the thrust. At McGregor, we've seen them using a much newer, a much faster thrust vectoring system, and Elon has mentioned on Twitter that that's because they're switching from hydraulic power to electric power, and that'll just allow them to have more control authority on their Raptor engines. So I also think it's supposed to be simpler. So that's what we're talking about there, and we are keeping an eye out to see any signs of where that might be implemented, maybe as soon as Booster 9, but not on the current vehicles. Good question. Oh yeah, there is the McGregor video show, and I believe this is going to show some TVZ tests. Yeah, on the left-hand side of it, you can see it moving really quickly. It's pretty cool to see.
Love to see it.
Oh yeah.
And also, while we're discussing McGregor, I think we had some interesting Raptor developments over the past week. Did we?
I don't know, did we?
Well, I'll answer that question. I was waiting for Thomas to pick it up. But yeah, SpaceX did do some interesting Raptor testing over the past few days. They've been testing rapid relight capability on Raptor. Now, what that means is that having, you see they're firing the Raptor like this, they'll shut it down, and then about 8 or 9 seconds later, quickly restart it. Now, we don't know exactly why they're doing this. My best guess personally would be testing for boost back burns, because with a boost back burn, obviously you're going to need to have a very rapid relight capability, like how they do on Falcon 9. But we've seen probably about at least 5 tests of this so far, both day and night, of Raptor rapid relights. So very cool to see that. Very nice capability to have. And yeah, again, it's great to see more development in the Raptor test cycle. Now you can see a shutdown there. Wait about 5 or so seconds from now, and then we're going to see a reignition.
There
we go.
Feels so cool to see.
It's so impressive too, because if you think about it, most rocket engines that fly are meant to be kind of like one-off. Like,
Right.
you could obviously fire them a few times, but like they're not meant to be restarted, a few seconds apart. So this capability is remarkable for a kind of engine like this. I remember back with like the space shuttle or with the Saturn V, if you ignited the engines, you're rolling back to the assembly building because you need to replace some components, do a lot of inspections, and it's going to be a multi-week delay. But whereas right here, 9 seconds apart, the engine has had 2 ignitions.
Yeah, and that I wanted to dive in. Let's talk about the different ways. Like, why would they be testing that capability? Is that a flight reliability thing? Like, we want engines that shut down during flight to be able to be restarted if they're functioning all right? Is this we can test the resilience of the engine by rapid relighting it, even if that's not something we would expect to do in flight? Is this all right, we're simulating a boost back burn or something like that?
Yeah, I mean it's a big question there, and we're not entirely sure what they're doing. Again, my guess is probably a boost back burn. Again, testing the resilience. Like this is an excellent show of the resilience of Raptor to be instantly shut down, then brought back to full power, because that is going from 1 bar of pressure to 230 bar of pressure, which is an insane change, a big dynamic environment, a lot of stresses on the engine to go from 230 to 1 to 230. And again, for anyone who's unfamiliar, 1 bar is 1 atmospheric pressure. So inside of Raptor's combustion chamber is 230 atmospheres of pressure, which is insane. So this is a great test of the resilience. And I guess, like you did say, maybe they could do like you were saying, like an in-flight restart. But I think it's a very like a niche capability. But with how much Starship is going to be flying, it wouldn't be bad to have this option available.
All right, gotcha.
Oh, yeah, Alex, correct me. I'm dumb. It's 300 bar of pressure, 230 tons of thrust, so even higher than I was saying.
Right, you just
Still
switch the
insane.
numbers there, gotcha.
Oh, yeah. Literally
All right.
breaking.
Bringing in some more questions here. Again, we're just taking some live Q&A here with some live views from Starbase and things like that, showing some replays of McGregor. Our next question here from Oliver. Will the laser-based Starlink communications be able to cover Starship throughout reentry with no blackouts? Have we heard anything about that?
Funny you asked that, because we have. SpaceX has filed FCC permits to communicate with Starship using Starlink during reentry to prevent plasma blackouts. They tested it on SN15, where they had a Starlink dish on the back of the ship, on the leeward side, so facing away from the heat shield tiles. And if things work out, hopefully they could do that on maybe Ship 24 or some future Starships and avoid a plasma blackout. And that'd be really helpful, because not only do you get continuous telemetry, but if something happens during reentry and say you lose the vehicle, you get data on what happened during that. So what would have been a plasma blackout.
Right, and I would imagine those permits are for things like testing that capability, right? Until they actually demonstrate it, you don't know if it'll functionally work, but it sounds like they're at least trying to make that happen, right?
Yes, yeah.
There you go. All right, let's see. Our next question here. Mike with the question, will the fuel depot have to perform small burns or use thrusters to push the liquid fuel towards the pickup, so towards vehicles that are refilling? Is that I remember talking about this once upon a time, Starship refueling was kind of pitched as you won't use pumps or anything, but literally you attach the vehicles to one another, and then by firing thrusters ever so slightly, you accelerate the ship's one direction and the fuel goes the other way. Is that still the plan, or are we expecting the Propellant depot to have some hardware to basically push fuel through? I mean, they haven't really demonstrated this yet.
Yeah, it probably will have to, because pumps in space aren't really that workable when you have the fluid floating around. You kind of need to force and coerce the fluid to go to where you want it.
Right.
And I know the way some of the Russian modules on the space station do it is by having accordion-like fuel tanks where you literally condense the fuel tank to get fuel out. But yeah, with Starship, it seems like it's going to be small thruster burns. I mean, Elon has specifically said that, I think in like the 2017 Starship presentation or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also super efficient because you don't have to add all this extra fancy hardware to it, so that's less mass, which means more fuel.
Yep.
I also wonder if another option would be using some sort of pressure difference. Though, like we've talked about it on the GSE side, especially at Cape. There are a lot of systems where instead of using pumps, you literally just change the pressure of either the vehicle or the GSE tank, and the pressure difference pushes propellant in the other direction. And like if you could alter the pressure of a tank on a Starship one way or the other,
that would work. But if you think about it, you need to have the propellant on the inlet. So you need to have some kind of ullage to get the propellant down to the bottom of the tank. So you'd need to use thrusters one way or another.
Well, there are pressure-fed tanks.
Huh. But they usually use ullage or are fully fueled.
But yeah, they're not. Yeah. I think there might be other options, but I mean, just cycling back to the latest official word is that yes, they're basically using very small ullage thrusters to do that. So, but again, I think on-orbit refueling is the big ticket item that we will hopefully be able to learn a little bit more about when they're getting ready to test that, and hopefully soon. Let's see. IDK says, do y'all think they will destack Ship 24 before the next static fire, which could be in the near future? So that's something to talk about. We've seen cryo testing on these vehicles whenever they're ready to move into Booster 7 static fire testing again. We would expect them to keep upping the number of engines, right? The latest tests were 7 engines. So is that a test that they would keep Ship 24 stacked on? Or, I mean, we know they have to remove the ship eventually to get rid of those crane lifting points, right? So would we expect a destack before static fire?
That's tough. I mean, there's not really any reason I can think of why you would need to. Maybe they'd want to just to be safe, because if say if they lose Booster 7, they won't lose this Ship 24 as well.
Right.
But I mean, I think having the ship on top would be a great way to get some data on, like, say, vibrations and noise environment inside the ship. Just my 2 cents, but that's kind of
fair, yeah. But I could also see them. Oh, go ahead, Sawyer.
No, I said I think it's also going to depend on how many engines you're testing at a time, too. If you're still kind of just working on a single ring of engines, you might keep it on since you at least have the data from 7, so scaling it up slightly isn't terrible. But as you get closer to 33, I think you might take it off then. That's when you can do any other modifications, cover up any attachment points, and then once you've done the 33 engine test, put it back on and do another one.
Right, I was going to say about gathering the data, like the acoustic data or whatever, the vibration data that Ian was talking about. You could remove the ship for the first 33 engine static fire, and then once you're confident that that won't come with any issues, you can do it again for more data gathering and have the ship on top. I think that kind of timeline makes sense to me.
Exactly what I was thinking.
Also, shout out to these up-close camera views, getting a slow-motion pan of the full stack right now.
I could watch this all day long. And I am not joking.
It's looking pretty cool. I got another super chat here from Starship 24 that says, "Don't send me to the drink." Sorry. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of pull in that department. You have to talk to SpaceX. Colin became a PadRat member, so we appreciate that. Tara says, "You film at artsy angles, but the Atlas V with a single SRB launches at artsy angles." Appreciate the support there, Taras.
411 love.
Yeah, 411. Oh, and did I say pan? Did I say slow motion pan? I did. This is a tilt. The same
Chat
thing I gave.
Again.
Same thing I made fun of for Ian earlier, and I messed it up. I'm sorry, Jack, if you're watching. Anyway, and Starship 24 now has a question. What booster will fly twice? Booster 9, Booster 10, or a higher number? I think earlier we were speculating it'd be in the 20 ranges, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other question that Ship 24 had, though, will we see a Raptor version 3 and possibly version 4? Or is version 2, somewhere in the realm of version 2, going to be the final version of Raptor?
I don't think we're close to a final version of Raptor anytime soon yet. Just with, how little it's actually flown. We've only done the 7-engine tests. Once it goes up and starts flying, and we get it orbital, they may find ways to improve upon it and enhance it. So I could definitely see it going at least version 3 or 4, if not more.
Agreed completely. I mean, if you look at Merlin too, which is kind of SpaceX's perfected engine, if I might say. Imagine back, say we're about like you were about 5 or so years into Raptor development, maybe about 7 into Raptor development. Imagine if in like 2012, everyone was like, okay, SpaceX just released Merlin 1D. They're done. That's it. No more Merlin development. But meanwhile, since then, we've seen subcooled propellants, we've seen Block 5, we've seen continuous improvements for Starlink launches that we know of. I think by the end of this decade, Raptor is going to be very different. We're going to be seeing pretty much a completely different engine in terms of the hundreds, if not thousands of flights you're going to get done this decade. Every little flight giving a bit of experience. I think Raptor is going to be evolving continuously as long as Starship exists.
Yeah, all right. Gotcha there. Another question here from Tremaine says, do you think the ship with no tiles could be a Luna Starship that NASA requested? Yeah, I think that was one potential option as some sort of test for the Lunar Starship. But I think there are also other options, and we'll have to wait and see exactly what they do with it before we really know. But some sort of test of a flapless ship or a heat shieldless ship, some simpler test article that won't attempt a reentry, basically. So I want to go around the horn, and we're coming up near the end of the show. So I do want to just go around and say, basically, what are we looking ahead to for like the next week or so with regards to Starbase and Starship overall? Are we expecting maybe a return to static fire testing yet? Are we expecting more cryo tests? What would we expect to see first? And the road closures start as early as Monday. So Ian, what are you looking for as the next milestone?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the next milestone would be either a multi-engine static fire or maybe a full cryogenic proof / wet dress rehearsal. I think either of those are really likely as the next possibility. But again, we're only going to find out what we're going to see either A, when they start loading propellant or liquid nitrogen in, or B, when Mary gets a static fire notice.
Sure. There you go. Also, yeah, so there's a temporary and intermittent road delay also on Monday from 6 to 8. That could be a rollback opportunity. I'm not sure we even talked about this yet. There are self-propelled modular transporters out near Booster 8, which could indicate that there's a rollback at that time. I don't think there are any vehicles ready to roll out, but they could be rolling one of the other vehicles, not Booster 7 or Ship 24 likely, but a different vehicle back to the production site for more work. Rather than a rollout there, but that's at the beginning of a much longer actual testing possible road closure window. So there could be actual testing on Monday as well.
I would say because it's a 2-hour road closure, and it says temporary and intermittent road delay, so they're definitely rolling something. Given that the SPMTs are new Booster 8, I would bet they're going to roll Booster 8 back. What for? I don't know. Maybe to do some upgrades, or maybe, like we speculated before, maybe they're just skipping it completely.
Sawyer, what do you think about the next set of milestones for Starship here at Starbase?
I mean, I think you nailed it right on the head. There's been doing all these different cryo tests that we've seen the last week. I think we're going to see a lot more cryo loading, hopefully even potentially full. But if nothing else, it'll be exciting once they get the results from that to start to see them spool up some engine tests again. So I'm hoping that maybe we'll see an engine light in the next week or two.
I'm definitely looking forward to more static fire testing because at this point, all upcoming static fire tests should be continuing to break records as far as how many Raptors have fired at once. They've already done that with a 7-engine firing, and hopefully they're just going to keep upping the number of engines until we get all 33, which will of course be insane. But as far as outside of Starbase, really quick, this was a pretty Starbase-centric episode, given that we hadn't done one of these in a while, and a lot of people often have questions about the Starship program. But SpaceX will also keep our attention over on the Kennedy Space Center side of things. Tuesday morning is the current target for Falcon Heavy launching the USSF 44 mission for the United States Space Force. And right on cue, there is the live view of Pad 39A. You can keep an eye on the pad over on Space Coast Live, which is our 24/7 cameras out in Florida. We'll expect a rollout to occur sometime between now and Tuesday morning. I know that wasn't exactly the most helpful sentence in the world, but I'm technically correct, the best kind of correct. But you can see right now the door is closed, the hangar, so should be undergoing payload integration right now, and we would expect that door to obviously open up before a rollout commences, but we'll keep an eye on that. And of course, follow us on Twitter, because I'm sure we'll all be tweeting out when a rollout is underway. You can also, of course, keep an eye on Starbase Live for 24/7 views of Starbase. And those are the 24/7 streams. We've also got McGregor if you want to keep an eye on Raptor testing and other engine testing that goes on in McGregor, Texas at SpaceX's facility there. 24/7 camera views there as well. I also want to give a big thank you to everyone who sends support on these streams with super chats or just asking questions or memberships and things like that. There is another way that you can also support what we do here at NASA Spaceflight, and that's, of course, becoming the launch director and flight engineer memberships, and you get your name at the end of this, on your screen at the end of NSF Live. So a huge thank you to those who go above and beyond with their support. Also, one other way to support us is, of course, heading to the shop. Shop.nasaspaceflight.com is a great way to support what we do. Lots of new merch there, including new Falcon Heavy merch if you want to sport that for the upcoming launch. Cool metal prints from Starbase and other places around the spaceflight world as well, and things like that. But I do want to also go around the horn and just thank people for hopping on here. Ian Atkinson hopped on comms with us today. So, Ian, how are you doing? Thanks so much for hopping on today.
Oh, it was a very fun show. I loved every minute of it. Thanks for having me on, Thomas.
Awesome. And Sawyer, thanks for hopping on comms as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and looking forward to doing more of these.
I think we've got one other person to thank really quick. I've been told to wait for like 60 seconds because we had another special guest on today's stream. Oh, there we go. We got the photo of him first. Our good buddy Das out there testing out some new camera locations, maybe. I don't know what he was up to, but he was walking around with a camera on his shoulder. And I think we're going to get one last goodbye from him. There we go. I think he's still working on getting that camera up and running, but Das has been running around in Starbase today and chiming in here and there. So Das, a shout out to Das for hopping on today and providing the DasCam camera views from around Starbase as well. There we go.
Oh, wow.
It's the Rocket Garden. That's a long walk, by the way, from where he was. I don't know if anyone's been to Starbase, but like, I'm impressed he's there already. The camera signal is also impressed that he made it that quickly and can't quite catch up with him.
That was about a mile and a half walk, yeah.
That's like a long time. But Das, thank you for showing us some unique camera views today as well. Oh, he did drive there. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. But yeah, getting his steps in, as he said. But I think that's going to do it for this week's episode of NASA Spaceflight Live. Stay tuned for launch coverage for Falcon Heavy, and as well as I think there's another Falcon 9 flight this week as well. So stay tuned for live coverage of that and other space news around the world. But that'll do it for NASA Spaceflight Live. Thank you all so much for watching. We will see you all next time.
Propulsion continues to be normal.
Chamber pressure looks good. Doubling up. Roger, planet.
Water towers, fly!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight downside SC off. Bring in SC off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.